You monster! You slaughtered everyone. My teammates, my family, everyone! A lone soldier stood in front of a young Frieza, Zarbon and Doria at his side. Hundreds of soldiers finishing off what remained of the rebellious populace. Family, Frieza's tail flickered about as he looked over the injured soldier. You know, my father never once showed me any affection, and look at how I turned out. Perhaps if you abandoned those notions of family and love, your race would have been able to survive. How dare you! My family was the only reason I raised a fist to your empire. They were all I had. The soldier began charging up a ball of energy in his hand. Zarbon went to move, but Frieza put a hand up, stopping his commander. And that's precisely why you lost. All it took was one attack on the cities housing your precious families, and your armies lost morale, practically giving up. Face it, for all you had, it meant nothing in the face of true power. I'll show you! The soldier swung his hand forward, launching his attack directly towards Frieza, who simply smacked it off into the sky. The Iceling had a wicked smile, watching as all the hope and anger faded from the soldier's now pale face. Realizing that he was of no importance, that there was no retribution, no justice for what had been done, he then fell lifeless to the ground, having spent every last bit of his life force on that attack. Frieza thought such a thing was pathetic. Why not try to run? Find some way to live and fight another day, even if that, too, was pointless. He floated over towards the body of said soldier, seeing someone who, although not special, could have served in his army and even been an officer. Oh well. Soon enough, Frieza will have a force large enough to run itself, especially with the Saiyans doing so well. Oh, speaking of which, Cold was supposed to introduce them to their new ruler soon. That was something the young Emperor was looking forward to. Oh, but he'd have to wait until the cleanup crew was done. So be it. Across the planet, a small boy had been walking through his once lively town. His family wasn't lucky enough to be close to one of the shelters, so they had to hide in their own home. Of course, his father had been drafted, and his mother, well, she was gone. In fact, his whole family was gone. His mother, aunt, sister. He saw them finished in front of his very own eyes. The boy came across a dead Frieza Force member, blaster still in hand, and a hole in his torso. These men, they were evil. And the boy thought that bad guys always got what was coming to them, that good always won out in the end. But as he looked at the broken city, the screams of survivors, buildings crumbling, blaster fire ringing out in the distance, it formed a cacophony of sorrow. Today, the bad guys won. Today, Chamomile was left alone. But the boy had little time to work through what had happened, due to both shock and the fact that he spotted a small girl underneath a piece of rubble. At first, he stood there, wondering what to do, a thick fog clouding his mind, before finally coming to and rushing over. He quickly uncovered the girl, though her crying continued, and being just a boy, Chamomile had no idea what to do. He stumbled backwards as he saw the extent of her injuries, and though it was just a small laceration to her thigh, to the boy it looked serious. The small amount of distance between Chamomile and this girl was the difference between life and death, as in only a second, she was gone. An explosion blew Chamomile back into a halfway collapsed wall, his head making a loud crack sound as it slammed against the stone. His vision blurry, blood trickling down his face, and lungs stripped of air, the boy could only sit still and look towards the assailants. Oh, that was a good shot. 2 in 1. Sad we missed the big battle, but at least we have the civvies to clean up. Chamomile could tell this soldier was green with blue armor. No fun. They don't put up a fight. This soldier had a bulky frame, far bigger than the former, and he was bright red. As the boy's vision began to clear a bit, he was able to make out more details about these two. The green one was a fish-like person, though he had no whiskers and only one fin on top of his head. The other was quite burly, having a full beard and large unkempt hair trailing down his back. They seemed to believe Chamomile was dead, and so moved on, though only a few seconds passed before the pair found another victim. This time it was a girl, likely only a few years older than the boy. She had stumbled through a doorway, likely having just woken from the explosions that rocked their city. Her blue skin and white hair made the girl stand out like a sore thumb, having even taken a few steps towards the soldiers, only to then realize they were clearly not there to help. It was too late though. The girl had been grabbed, and the soldiers proved they were just as evil as those that had attacked Chamomile's family. He remembered what they had done to his older sister, the way they mercilessly ended his mother's life yet tortured the others. All he could do was watch, too scared to do a single thing. A large pit formed in his stomach, a spiral of dread and hopelessness, and then hatred. He hated that someone could hurt another person like this. Why did people have to be so evil? Why couldn't they just stop, just see that what they were doing was wrong? Chamomile looked away from the poor girl, unable to watch any further, spotting the dead soldier from earlier. He thought it could only be a good thing that such a person had perished, clinging to his blaster like a coward. Chamomile's mind traveled to the other two monsters still alive in front of him. The two who were just as bad, just as evil, and just as deserving of that same fate. Without thinking, the boy found himself standing over the dead soldier, aiming that heavy blaster directly at them, one of which noticed. "Oh, what do we have here? This kid thinks he's tough, huh? You take your time with her. I'll teach this kid a lesson." The fishman pulled his pants up before going for his own blaster. Only, he never made it. A yelp rang out as the soldier fell to his knees, a large hole having been made where his lungs once were. Despite his grievous injuries, he was still alive, gasping and reaching for his partner, who had now stopped and was looking towards the kid. He tapped his scouter, and then read a power that terrified him. 2,000. He stepped away from the girl, promising it was all his partner's idea, that he didn't want to do that at all, but Chamomile couldn't hear a word he said, nor would he have even believed it. His soft face had been twisted and morphed by hatred, and without a second thought, he blasted the remaining soldier. Like the first, he survived, but a second shot, then a third, took care of that. Once they were thoroughly dealt with, Chamomile turned back towards the girl, though she backed up, clearly terrified of him as well. He tried to say something, but his throat was sore and swollen, and as he stepped closer, within the broken building that was once her home, he stepped onto a shattered mirror. His hair, once white and pure, had been stained red with blood. He held tight onto the oversized blaster, an instrument meant for nothing but harm, and his eyes were puffy and bloodshot. With the adrenaline in his system starting to wear off, and the realization that he had just ended two people, he fell to his knees. Both Chamomile and this girl were likely the last of their species, having survived the slaughter of their people, their families, and been attacked themselves. Emotions were running high. None of this felt real, like it was a bad dream they'd soon wake up from. But that wasn't the case, and they knew that on some level. There, they sat in silence, unsure of what to do, or what to feel. A few hours later, Frieza was watching his soldiers do some cleanup, gathering their wounded and taking count of the dead. Zarbon was in charge of all the clerical jargon, making sure to write down all the numbers, although Frieza considered this a complete success. He walked the streets of a ruined town, head held high, not thinking much of the architecture that these people were capable of. It was serviceable at best, though hardly held up when Dodoria assaulted their cities. He then came across a destroyed house, one which seemed pretty tall and extravagant, half of its structure still intact while the other half had collapsed in on itself. Following the avalanche of stone, the Iceling spotted a small crevice, a hole in the debris, where 3 humanoids could be spotted. When stepping closer, the child's red eyes could make out 2 adults and 1 child. The father and mother appeared to have attempted to shield their child from the debris, but it wasn't enough, as the small blue boy in their arms was unmoving. Or so Frieza thought, as the boy began to stir, then cry out. He didn't pay it any mind though, his eyes instead fixated on his parents, their warm expressions and embrace around said child. This was something completely foreign to the Iceling, having no experience with this at all. This was a hug, and for some reason, it absolutely irritated the Emperor. This whole damned planet was full of nothing but soft-bellied cowards who used love as their crux. Frieza aimed a finger towards the boy, the area lighting up with pink light as their cries were silenced. Moments later, Zarbon approached his liege, telling him of their losses, including a missing ship, though it seemed the Iceling's mind was elsewhere. When the space crocodile began again, Frieza nonchalantly told him that none of it mattered, and to save the report for his father, as he was the only one who cared for those. The two then silently walked back to Frieza's ship, where the Iceling called his father, telling him of their success on planet Hibiscus. Despite having minimal casualties and taking the planet in record time, the king reprimands his son for impulsively rushing in on the same day he was supposed to be named the successor to Cold's army. Frieza, in an attempt to steer the conversation around, tells his father of the fact that his forces were on cleanup duty, and the men he left here should be able to make this planet worth selling within the next 10 hours. Cold, however, once more gets onto Frieza. Why waste the manpower on cleaning up when the Heeters were hired for that very reason? The king goes on about the deal he made with them so long ago and how as good businessmen they had to honor that deal and blah 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 blah. He then went on to tell Frieza that he better not be late, though the young prodigy chose to slyly threaten the king as he knew that his own power had recently surpassed his father's. The Emperor to be quickly composed himself though, and ended the call as cordially as one could expect, before promptly blasting a nearby soldier. He walked off towards his quarters, livid about how nothing he did could ever please his father. Not that the old man's opinions really mattered. I mean, why did it matter to the Iceling? He was in the same position as his father now, taking over the Cold Force and acting not as a king, but an emperor. Concubines wanted him. He was incredibly intelligent, worked even harder than his father, and was now even more powerful than them, and still so young. Truly, Frieza had everything a being in the universe could ever want. And yet, his mind kept wandering to that scene in the city and how his father would never do the same for him. When walking into the captain's quarters, Frieza saw Berry Blue ironing out a cape, one similar to what Cold wore. She greeted him as per usual, her narrow gaze seeing right through the boy's very soul. She guessed that Frieza had just gotten off a call with his father, and was as angry as ever. The Iceling had half a mind to end that woman then and there, but he couldn't, something that only irritated him further. He chose to change the subject, asking what Berry Blue was doing there. Well, King Cold had a special piece of armor constructed just for you, along with a cape that matches his own. If anything, it shows he expected you to be just like him. I am nothing like my father. I have no need for armor, nor do I wish to brandish the symbol of such a bloodline. With a flick of the wrist, the cape was lit ablaze, and a wave of his hand also shattered the armor that hung nearby, the pieces causing quite a mess, which his attendant quickly got to work cleaning up. Zarbon, Frieza called over the intercom. We're leaving this wretched planet immediately. Set a course for planet Vegeta. If Cold wanted his son to be a ruthless and efficient emperor, then Frieza would become just that. But he'd never be like that man. He would do things his own way. Off in another part of the universe, several insect-like creatures burrowed out from beneath their planet's crust. They were in a rush, scurrying about as a large mass of black sludge escaped the Earth. One of the insects was unfortunate enough to be grabbed by this creature, swept up into its body. A screech sounded out from the insect before its carapace was crushed, its organs sucked up into the sludge, which reached out to swallow up the other insects as well. Once done, the gargantuan blob of sludge began to shrink, large swaths of mass falling off and melting away until a singular humanoid was left. With black armor which seemed to hug its body, almost acting as skin, and a maw which was permanently fixed agape, its sickly pale form contrasted against a blood-red sky. This world had been completely torn apart, made barren, meaning this creature's hunger would only be satiated by traveling to yet another location. It had traveled the outskirts of the eastern galaxy and inched closer and closer to its border. From this planet, he could sense it, the immense power growing rapidly across the vast expanse of the universe. Nearby, there were 3 large powers and many smaller ones, which would only serve to fuel this avarice anomaly. It took the better part of 12 hours to arrive at planet Vegeta, with Frieza feeling an intense dread every second of the way there. It wasn't a completely new feeling, as meeting with his father often had the Emperor feeling anxious to a degree, but this was a little different, a little bit more. He had no idea why, as he'd already surpassed his father in strength, this being the deciding factor in his ascension to the throne. If anything were to happen, Cold wouldn't be able to hurt him like before. So then, why did Frieza feel this way? Well, Berry Blue seemed to catch on to this when checking up on the boy. That wry smile of hers flashed bright enough to reflect in the window Frieza had been staring out of, causing him to turn around and compose himself. He puffed his chest up and took up the stance of an emperor, preparing for the rendezvous with his father on Vegeta's largest moon. Berry Blue announced that they were close, but where she'd usually leave, possibly even make a sly remark, she instead stepped further into the room and closed the door. She wasn't a fan of the new Scouter models, but even so, Frieza had the feeling if she were wearing one, it'd be turned off right now. "Lord Frieza," she started, wiping a speck of dust off the Emperor's shoulder pad. "I've been reassigned to another department." This was shocking, as she'd been instrumental in Frieza's development and acted as one of his top advisors. She was only second to Zarbon in terms of tactical and strategic knowledge, having trained hundreds of effective officers in the Force before her tenure with the Iceling. "You've been trained by your father, groomed to rule. Royalty is in your blood. You may have to face situations that aren't ideal, but you are Lord Frieza, Emperor of the universe. Never forget that." Before he could ask what this was all about, Zarbon entered the room, followed by some blue fellow with light blonde hair. The Iceling could tell this person was powerful, mostly due to the fact that Zarbon seemed to sweat bullets when glancing towards the guy. This, coupled with Berry Blue's words, made the Emperor stand on edge. "Monsieur Frieza, I am Souza. King Cold sent me to escort you." He bowed down, though his eyes were fixed on the Iceling. "Well, thank you, Thousa, or whatever your name was, but I have my own entourage, so your services won't be required." Frieza glared at the grunt, who stood steadfast. "No can do, monsieur. I have my orders." Salza, now staring the Emperor down, started to sweat a little. His hand reached down towards a pocket in his armor, intent in his eyes. The two stayed there for a while, tension growing as Frieza slowly lifted his hand, preparing to blast this fool into the afterlife, before Berry Blue spoke up. "Lord Frieza, it would be wise to allow your father's messenger to guide us. The base has gotten much bigger since you were last here. Besides, how else would we have proper communication with your father without his underling here?" Frieza looked over the soldier, seeing that he was already wearing the new model of Scouter. How was this possible? Not even his men had been fully equipped with those, though that would be rectified soon as this base had large stores of said item. But then he remembered the secondary reason for designing said Scouters, the fact that anyone could be listening through them, including Cold. Fine, you may accompany my entourage on our way towards father's ship. Zarbon, gather the guard." Salza led the group from their landing bay over towards a hangar that housed King Cold's massive mothership. There, the monarch stood tall, his shadow completely swallowing Frieza up as he stood before the Titan. Silence filled the room. Even some of the Saiyans around seemed to slow their work so as not to make any noise. Cold then smiled, welcoming his son to Soil, the largest moon of planet Vegeta. The two hastily got through the pleasantries when Cold caught onto his son's attitude. He then sighed, before regaining his composure, a smile reappearing on his face. "Frieza, if the Saiyans were to rebel, how would you handle such a situation?" Cold leaned over, his imposing figure intimidating everyone around, though Frieza stood defiant. "The same as I'd do with any rebels. I'd get rid of them." The Emperor narrowed his eyes, scanning over his father's face, trying to figure out what this was all about. The king seemed disappointed with this answer, putting a hand over his face and rubbing his nose. "And what of the Heeters? You've been stealing their business with deals of your own, Frieza. There's been talks of them pulling their soldiers out of our forces." "Ha, we are leagues stronger than them. Why even deal with such weaklings anymore? Their forces would be crushed if they ever tried to dissolve our alliance." This, too, elicited a sigh from the king, but this time, someone else spoke up. "And then you'd be lacking both the Saiyans and the Heeters' military might. You'd be reduced to a handful of capable warriors. The Frieza force would be easy pickings for the thousands of factions vying for dominance over this galaxy." Frieza turned to see a figure covered in shadow, only stepping out once his point had been made. There, standing with pride and dignity, yet with a glare that showed nothing but contempt, was another Iceling. He couldn't be any older than Frieza, as his body was still a light pink or red, though his shoulder pads had hardened, just as Frieza's had. Cold always made it sound as if they were the only ones of their kind, saying their race had been destroyed by a meteor, and the king was all that survived. But this chap, whoever he was clearly one of them. "Lord Frieza, I am Cooler, son of King Cold. Father has allowed us to meet as a test, to see which of us is worthy of succeeding him." Cooler raised a fist towards Frieza, stepping closer and closer, preparing for a fight. Salza ordered Frieza's entourage to move out of the way, igniting a Keyblade and threatening to execute any who disobeyed. The smile on Cold's face seemed to glow with excitement, and many of the Saiyans around were frozen in fear. The Emperor couldn't believe any of this. It was like he was in some sort of odd nightmare. He had a brother, and supposedly Cold wanted them to fight to the death in order to determine the next emperor? Just what was going on? The Iceling, however, had no chance to ask, as Cooler flew right in and landed a devastating punch to his jaw. His brother had put so much force into that attack that it broke Frieza's jaw, a nasty crack reverberating through the room. "You won't have a chance of beating me like that. Hurry up and transform so we can get this over with." Cooler stood over his brother, a look of disgust on his face. Frieza knew that all too well. It was the same one Cold often had. This pissed the Emperor off, who stood and began to transform, the sheer power on display causing the moon itself to shake. If this charlatan wanted a fight, it'd be a fight he'd get. Cooler seemed to sweat at the power of his brother, taking up a defensive stance as Frieza flew in and delivered a powerful punch as payback. The Iceling flew directly into a Saiyan vessel, it going up in flames as he crashed into its engines. However, the smoke allowed Cooler to fire several death beams towards his opponent, who swiftly redirected every single one. This did prove enough of a distraction for him to go around the smoke, flying low to the ground and going for a leg sweep. This catches Frieza by surprise, and once he's on the ground, Cooler uses an axe kick as a follow-up attack. The two are surprisingly even, both having drawn blood by this point. But as Frieza blocks the kick, he begins to show off more and more of his power, going to his full 50% and easily blowing his brother away. Now this seemed to get Cooler's attention, and rightly so, as now things were in Frieza's favor. The Emperor took joy in having such a large advantage, happily holding back so as not to end the fight too quickly. Cooler, for his part, was doing everything he could to stay in the fight, using distractions, feints, even telekinesis to get the best of Frieza. But none of his attacks could even scratch him at this point. Things were looking dire, but that's when Cooler stood up, wiped the blood from his lip, and revealed he had one further transformation, which Frieza thought was complete bull. It's true. I knew I was inferior to you and father. I had to work to get as far as I have, unlike you. Now, witness my true power. Cooler began to transform, but Frieza, being ever skeptical, quickly fired several death beams into his brother's arms and legs. No, I don't think I will be witnessing your power. You'll die here, as weak and pathetic as any who have challenged me before. Frieza began to charge up a large death beam. However, some sort of force suddenly overcame the Emperor, and he looked over to see a group of small green men, all with their eyes trained directly on him. Thank you, Gordo. It seemed your help was needed after all. I'll make sure you and your people get proper compensation for this. Cooler shakily stood, and then transformed. Frieza managed to break free of whatever technique those soldiers had and went to blast them all away, but Cooler stopped this with a tackle that utilized his shoulder pauldrons, causing the Emperor to spit up. The force behind such an attack was mind-boggling, this reminding Frieza of the first time King Cold hit him. After a few failed counterattacks and a few more hits from his opponent, the Iceling decided that he should finally go all out. Cooler surprisingly allowed his brother to power up to 100% before the two charged at each other once more. This time, they were evenly matched, going blow for blow in a scuffle that caused the hangar bay to fall apart. Their relativity surprised Cooler, as while he'd never fought his brother, he had extensively studied fighting techniques and had been mentored by many masters. Yet, here Frieza was, able to keep up, something that could only be chalked up to a natural gift for fighting. However, no amount of talent could close the gap in what would ultimately decide this battle, and that was stamina. Cooler had trained in both his base and powered up state, and while his control over the fifth form wasn't perfect, it was far better than Frieza's. As time went on and the two slowed down, the Emperor found himself slowly slipping up, his mind foggy, his body just a split second behind Cooler's, his attacks not as lethal as before. Soon Frieza fell out of his powered up state, and seconds later, it was Frieza who was on his knees before Lord Cooler, who held a single finger towards the jewel on his brother's head. There were no words to describe how the Emperor felt, nothing that could properly explain this situation. The fear, the humiliation, the way his heart seemed to be trying to escape from his chest. He looked over towards Cold, seeking mercy, but the king seemed morbidly intrigued by the outcome. Frieza then turned towards his entourage, which now only consisted of Zarbon and Berry Blue. He pleaded for help, for anything from the two, but his commander was too scared to even think about moving, and Berry Blue simply held her head low. Good, Cooler. Now, kill him, Cold said with considerable delight. Cooler stayed still though, yet his blast remained just as bright as ever. Cooler, sparing your brother could only lead to trouble. He's a threat to our empire, to the galaxy. Do it. Now. Cold leaned forward, though next to Cooler, his stature wasn't as imposing. The blast in the new Emperor's finger seemed to get even brighter as he prepared to attack, only to then lift his finger high into the air, launching a massive pink beam into space. No, we don't kill our own kind. He'll spend every day knowing just how weak he really is. Let him live out the rest of his existence bitter and alone. Cooler powered down just as several galactic patrol ships came into view. Despite the patrol and force being on opposing sides for years now, nobody dared to fire on each other. Salza flagged the ships down, ordering them to land right where the two brothers had their fateful battle. Several high-ranking patrol members surrounded Frieza, yet it was a well-dressed blue man who ultimately shackled him. The former Emperor recognized this man as a Lek, him smiling as a power-dampening collar was placed on the ice sling. The patrolmen then picked Frieza up and escorted him back towards their ship. It all happened so fast that the former Emperor hardly had time to take it in, let alone process what was happening. But he could hear the exacerbated grunts of Cold as he stood up and seemingly made his way over. If you can't finish this, Cooler, then I will, Cold yelled out. You trusted me with this test, with this empire, did you not? I will be made Emperor of this galaxy, and his fate is my decision to make. The galaxy does not belong to you anymore, Father. There was a sharp edge in Cooler's words, as if this were a matter of life and death to him. Before Frieza could hear his father's response, he was packed into the back of a patrol car. At the station, many of the patrolmen cheered as the iceling was being processed. He was assigned a prison number, a jumpsuit, and given a rundown of how things worked down there. The warden himself came down to intimidate Frieza, but he simply went through the motions. This was all impossible to believe, an outcome that would never have occurred in Frieza's worst dreams, yet here he was. And even if it didn't feel real, on some level, he knew it was. In just one day, he had gone from the Emperor of the universe to a prisoner of the Galactic Patrol. From a power level of 120 million to a power level of 1. And judging by the looks several prisoners had given him while being escorted towards his cell, everyone knew exactly who he was. The only saving grace was that his cell was empty, save for the thinnest of cots and a sink that sat directly above the toilet. The door then suddenly opened behind the Emperor, and Frieza half expected to see a soldier come in and address him as their lord. But no, it was a guard holding their baton, followed by several more men, each with a score to settle.